tutorial on using SPSS. We're going to speak today about a little bit of the basics of how you use SPSS to enter a codebook, which is one of our objectives of this course. So I'm going to start off. I'm going to be switching back and forth a little bit for some screen shares, so that way you can see what it is I'm actually doing in SPSS and kind of follow along and play around with it as you are making your own code book. So one of the first things I'm going to do is I have a blank SPSS data sheet open, and I'm going to switch over share my screen so that way you can see what's going on. So give me 1 second. And whoa. Alright, and here we are. Wait, okay, there we go. Sorry for the little confusion there. Alright, so one of the things I mentioned is that we are looking at inputting data and looking at creating a code book using the variable view. So to use the variable view, you're going to go over here to the bottom, and you're going to see where it says variable view. And then each column is going to tell us what we need to know about a specific variable. And the more information we put on about each variable, the more information SPSS is going to be able to provide us with about that variable when we're using and running analyses later on. So as you see here, there are different rows, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, when they keep going down. We can have as many variables as we need in SPSS, in the tens of thousands. I can't remember the specific numbers. But you can see here, variable 1, row 1, the name of the variable. Now, creating a variable, one of the best practices to do is to use a variable name that you'll probably remember, but it's something that's going to be short. It's probably going to be about 8 characters long. So you want to do something memorable and short. When we have blocks of variables, sometimes it helps us to kind of name the block and then give it a number. But for now, I'm just going to start off easy. We're going to start with the first variable, which tends to be a respondent's ID or name. Typically, you don't use names because people are responding anonymously. So in this first variable, I'm going to name it RESPID. And to me, I understand that as respondent ID. Somebody else looking at it may think it's something else, but in the context of our data set, they probably will also get that it's the respondent ID. We go to the next column, and it says type numeric. Now, most of the variables that we're going to be working with are going to be numeric variables. Occasionally, when you've collected data through a survey online, you may have a string variable or a dollar amount, but we're going to be using primarily numeric variables. So I'm just going to leave that alone. We can leave the width alone. This is not something we're going to really concern ourselves with right now. And the decimals, well, because it's just an ID and it's nominal, I'm going to click 0. I'm going to label this something longer so that way people can see what it is that RESPID actually stands for in longer terms. So respondent ID. The values that I'm going to be using, I don't need any specific values because, again, this is more nominal and this is not for anything other than to identify that respondent's ID number. In case I need to go back for anything in his survey response, I can do that, but I don't need any actual value for this. It has no real meaning. So I'll leave it alone for now. In the missing values, typically we treat this as none, that there are no missing values. We assume there are no missing values, and in this instance, there are no missing values. SPSS is able to run calculations of things with missing values, but again, when you don't have the full information, it's going to be a little bit problematic. So we want more information. We want people to answer all the questions. But in this instance, again, we're going to leave this as no missing values. The columns we can leave alone for our purposes right now. We can leave the alignment alone. Now this next column is important. This column starts off unknown, as you can see here, what we want to do is identify what the measure is. Is it a scale variable, aka continuous variable, aka interval variable or ratio variable, or is it ordinal or nominal? And again, this is important information to give SPSS now, because this will determine how SPSS calculates and runs analyses using the variable. So when you're using a binary variable, such as yes, no, there's no shades of gray. It's either yes or no. If you have this checked off as a scale variable, it's going to run it as a continuous variable. And obviously, yes, no is non-continuous. So for this purpose, we're going to use respondent ID as nominal, and now we're all set. So let's create a second variable, and we will call this variable shop freak. That sounds a little weird. This is going to be a numeric variable, so we'll go back there. And the label, we'll call this how often do you shop at this store. As you can see, that's a much longer label than the variable name. But if I was to look at it, I would know shop freaks is shopping frequency. So again, it's a kind of a best practice to get into. The values, now here we may use some more values. So we may do a value of 1 as once a week. We want to make sure to add that variable. 2 equals 1 equals, let's say, twice a month. That doesn't make sense. Once a week. What else? Once a month. Add. 3 will be once every 6 months. 4 will be once a year. 5 will be never. Again, these are being made off the spot. If I was to give it a little bit more thought, I would probably change these value labels, but I'm just using this as an example. Now what will happen is any person's response that's labeled 1 will come up with this value label. Number 2, they respond to 2, it'll be this value label. Okay, so we hit OK, and our values are input. And again, I may just want to go check this back off to 0 because we're dealing with whole numbers in our responses. There's no missing data, and this was a scale variable. Again, because this goes from 1 through 5 continuously. Let's try 2 more. We'll do 2 more very quickly. I'm going to show how often do you shop at the store. How much, we'll call this perch Q. And I'm going to make this numeric. And this can go for 0 because we're going to deal in whole. And I'm going to call this a how many items did you buy today? Again, because this is a continuous variable, and almost because this is a ratio variable, it's going from 0 to whatever, I can leave these values alone, because the values are not, the labels for the values mean nothing on this variable. But what we do want to make sure is that we have it as a continuous scale variable, going from 0 to infinity. And finally, we'll do one more. We'll do gender, because that's a typical one. We'll do gender. What is your gender? I'll do a value as 0 is male. Add it. Whoops, one more. Female. And you know what? I could even say 3 decline to disclose. Edit. Whoops. Actually, I want to change this. So if I do that, and I go and I start making the change, I can now change, and you see it's replaced it to 2. Okay. Now, what will happen is if I switch over to data view, you can see that the variable names are now at the top of the columns. Alright, now I'm going to just switch back briefly because I want to just make sure that everything is going the way I wanted it to. Whoops. Okay. Now what we have here are the variables to input the data in this data view. When we look at rows, we're looking at cases. And what we call a case is a respondent's full set of data points. All of the respondent's responses for all of the variables. So case 1 will be this respondent's data for this variable, this variable, this variable, this variable. Case 2 will be respondent 2's data points for this variable, this variable, this variable, and this variable, and so forth and so forth. And we can have as many respondents as we need. You can have 1,400 respondents, 14,000 respondents, so forth. Obviously, you're not probably going to go collecting all of that data by hand, but just to show you what we can do with this. Again, the response ID was whatever we wanted to call it. So we'll do response 1, respondent 2, respondent 3, respondent 4, for example. Okay, so respondent 1, his ID number was 1. We said shopping frequency was a scale from 1 to 5. We'll say that his response was 4. He purchased 0 items, and his gender was male, and we said male was 0. Okay. Number 2, the shopping frequency was, again, 4, but purchased 3 items, and the gender was, again, male. Okay, shopper number 3, shopping frequency was 1, purchase quantity was 2, and gender was declined to disclose. So was actually a 2, sorry. And then lastly, this shopper response ID is 4. The shopper frequency was 3. They purchased 1 item, and their gender was female, which was 1. Okay, so now all of the data was entered. Because we have all of this data, what we can now do is we can then output the code book. So how do we output the code book? Well, the first thing we do is we go to the Analyze menu, we go to Reports, and then we go to Code Book. And you'll notice over here that all of the variables we have are listed here. And you'll notice as I hover over, it shows the variable label and the variable ID, or the variable name. Sometimes you can show the variable labels, and sometimes you can show the variable names. And that's why I mentioned it's sometimes helpful to have a nice variable name, because if I show like this, I know which variables I'm referring to. And that makes it easier and less cluttered than this. So for our instances here, we're just going to show variables shopping frequency, purchase quantity, and gender, because we really, in this example, don't need to know anything about our respondent ID. So we're going to highlight the variables of interest. We're going to move them over to the codebook variables. And those are the variables that are going to be in the codebook. Okay, now, the next thing I need to do is look at output. Now, we're going to just do the variable order in the variable list, in the order that we have our variables by column. You can change that if you'd like, but it's probably just as convenient to leave it as is. The same thing with this maximum number of categories, and the same thing with this file information. The file information is only talking about where this particular file is located on your hard drive, so you really don't need that in this instance. We're more concerned about this variable information. We want to know the position, the label. Actually, we don't really need to know the position, but we do want to know the label. We do want to know the type. We do want to know the format. We do want to know the measurement level. We actually don't need to know the role in this particular instance. So I'll actually uncheck that because I don't need that information. We do want to know the value labels. We want to know what we do with missing values and if there are any to identify. And we want to know if there are any custom attributes. So we'll just leave that. And now we'll look at the statistics. And because we have some nominal variables, and because we have some, actually we have one more nominal variable I didn't do. This one. I'm just going to go back because I was remembering. This was actually a nominal variable as well, the gender. It was a good thing I looked at that. All right. Now let me go back to Analyze Reports Codebook. I'm going to go back and select all of these. I'm going to go back to my output. And now I look at the statistics. Now with the codebook output, SPSS will allow us to see counts for frequencies, percentages, again, and you can read here in the directions here, it does anything of labeled values of scale and all nominal and ordinal variables. All right. Now here we have things, outputs for central tendency and dispersion, which we will go over later on. But you can get the mean of any scale variables that are in the codebook, the standard deviation, and the quartiles. And I'm just going to do that because I'm going to show you all of these here. And when I output, another window pops up, and here we see the codebook. Here's the variable for shopping frequency, the label, the type, the scale, excuse me, how many valid responses there are, whether there are any missing responses, what the mean is, what the standard deviation is, what the quartile is, and all labeled values. And as I mentioned before, the count and percent for scales are only for labeled values. So if there's no label, then there will be no count and percent. Scrolling down, you can see again for purchase quantity. Again, because there's no labels for that, because it was a ratio scale, we have no labeled values there. But that's fine because we had no labeled values. And then finally, for gender, you can see here, again, the valid values, how many were male, how many were female, and one declined to disclose. And because it's a nominal variable, there was no means or standard deviations because nominal variables, as we will discuss, have no central tendency or dispersion. Alright, so that's an example of how we would use SPSS for creating a code book and outputting it. And once we're done with outputting it, what we can do is we can go to File, Export, and then we can export selected all visible like you would do in any Windows program. But we can export it to HTML, we can export it to PDF, PowerPoint, or Word doc, so that way we can make modifications or hand it in for an assignment or print out a report or so forth. So if we want to do that, we can do that here. All right, now I'm just going to show you very briefly what we have. I'm going to come back here. We're going to get dizzy for a second. Come on. Okay. So what we've done so far is we've essentially come up with a brief code book for a couple of variables that we could use, report some data, run statistics on, and so forth. And we've been able to validate that by outputting it. Now, the next thing I want to just do briefly before I end this session is to just show you on something that has a lot more data. So one of the things that researchers will tend to use now more frequently is internet-based survey software, such as Qualtrics, which I use, many researchers use, several businesses use, or the SurveyMonkey software, which is frequently used. It's a little bit cheaper, so that's why more people use it, but Qualtrics has a lot more data that it can collect. Anyways, I'm going to just show you something that's already been collected by myself in Qualtrics, and this is research that I'm currently doing. And so we'll select over to share the screen, get dizzy for a second, and go. Okay, so you can see here again in the variable view I have measurements for authentic consumption experience. So auth1 is authentic question 1, auth2 is authentic question 2, auth3 authentic question 3, and so forth. You'll see one here for experience. You'll see for satisfaction, you'll see for consumer value, and so forth, all the way down here until we get to some of the demographic variables, such as gender, age, education, income, and other variables you would use in a research survey. Alright, so again, most of these are all numeric. We can ignore the width. None of these are decimals. I don't think any of them. A couple of them are decimals, but they didn't need to be, so that's fine. The labels, again, the labels here are really long. So it can be a little bit confusing to read that long label. So that's why, again, it sometimes helps to have variable IDs that are short but are meaningful. You can see here the values are all labeled 1 through 7. These are all labeled 1 through 7 on this scale. This scale is labeled not at all the way through very much. This is labeled very unlikely to very likely. And these are not labeled as robustly as I would like. And then there are a couple of demographics, for instance, ethnicity. Again, this would be a categorical variable, nominal. Same with race. Again, these are typically used for control variables, and we'll talk about control later on when we talk about regression. And we have here some education, and again, your standard gender labels. And you can see that these are nominal and versus scale variables. And again, I probably should actually change these over to nominal. This is an income, so it's probably ordinal. This is nominal, and so forth. Now what happens is I go over to the data view, and you can see respondent 1 has entered responses for all these data points except these. These are missing variables. So when SPSS looks at it, it's going to tell me how many people, how many transportation, because I know that this is transportation number 2 are missing, and it's going to run its calculations, but it's going to tell me that there are a lot of responses missing. Respondent 2, all of the data points, respondent 2, respondent 3, and all the way down to respondent 134, all of the data points that respondent 134 answered to the variables. Now, just to show you how overwhelming a codebook can be once you get this big of a survey, we go to Analyze Reports Codebook, and I want to add all of these variables. I will output not the position, not the format, and not the role, and I want statistics including counts and percents, means, standard deviations, and so forth. Oops, forgot to add them. There we go. Now I do this. I go back to my output, and you can see that my code book for this is extremely long. You just keep going and going and going and going and going and going. But I can look at this code book and see exactly where things might be needing to be labeled. So this is labeled 1 through 7, but I don't know what that means, and so forth. Actually, okay, let's see. I mentioned there were a couple that were missing a couple of values. Let's see if I can find one that was missing a bunch of respondents. Okay, here's one. Question 13.1. This was renamed the variable. While I was watching performance, activity going on in the room was around me was on my mind. You can see that 43 were valid and 91 were missing. That means only 43 people answered this response out of the total 134 people. The mean was of this answer was 2 with a standard deviation of 1.54. And then it tells me a distribution, a count distribution, a frequency count of all labeled variables. So here's the frequency. Most of the people said not at all. And then so forth. So if I come back, I'll unshare my screen for a second. Come on. Here we go. All right. So as you can see, it's actually gotten a little bit darker outside since I started, but there's a lot going on here in the variable view as well as in the data view. So we can use all of this, and we will be using all of this as we go through the rest of the course and run some further analyses. But we need to get from the pieces of the puzzle A and B before we can get all the way to having a fully complete picture. So we're doing that right here, and I hope that this helps a little bit for you to figure out how to make a code book, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.